Mid-18th century. While Europe was consumed by court intrigues and territorial wars, one of history's most incredible hoaxes unfolded in the Balkans. Its central figure was a man whose true name, origin, and even nationality remain a mystery to this day, a subject of fierce debate. He was a nobody, an unknown wanderer, perhaps a former soldier or doctor, a man without a past, seemingly dissolved into the currents of time. Yet this obscure vagrant achieved the unthinkable. Arriving in tiny, strife-torn Montenegro, he audaciously proclaimed himself none other than Emperor Peter III of Russia, miraculously saved from the assassins of his own wife, Catherine the Great. He was more than just an impostor. He became a de facto ruler, a reformer, a legislator who managed to unite disparate tribes and establish a semblance of a state. For 7 years, from 1768 to 1773, something unprecedented occurred. This mysterious stranger governed Montenegro as its absolute sovereign. He waged wars, concluded peace treaties, enacted reforms, built roads, and even minted his own currency. Discard any naive notions that he was merely a primitive charlatan who deceived a handful of illiterate peasants. Stepan Maly was not just a clever swindler. He proved to be the architect of a new reality, a man whose actions had real, tangible consequences that altered the course of an entire region's history. His phenomenon is less a story of deception and more a tale of unprecedented creation. But what kind of person was capable of such a flight of imagination and will, of such a risky and grand transformation? What fertile ground gave rise to this extraordinary audacity? The story of Stepan Maly begins long before his appearance in the Balkans, in the unknown void that preceded his phenomenal metamorphosis. We do not know his real name, his date of birth, or even the precise place where he first drew breath in the 18th century. Yet it was precisely this anonymity, this complete freedom from the shackles of a conventional past, that likely became his primary, invisible weapon. Imagine a rootless individual wandering through a Europe torn by wars and intrigues, observing its upheavals, absorbing lessons of survival on its streets and roads. A person who perhaps endured a personal tragedy or encountered an insurmountable social barrier that turned him into an outcast, depriving him of ordinary paths to recognition. The psychological profile of an adventurer like Stepan Maly inevitably reveals an exceptional, almost mystical personality. He was not merely a madman believing his own lies, but a shrewd psychologist capable of reading the crowd's thoughts, discerning their hopes and fears, and masterfully manipulating the collective consciousness. He must have possessed incredible charisma, a hypnotic gift of persuasion, and a deep, intuitive understanding of human nature. Perhaps he was a former soldier, familiar with discipline and hierarchy, yet also with the chaos of war, where the rules of life and death shifted instantly, and survival demanded extraordinary quick-wittedness. Or perhaps a doctor who witnessed suffering and pain, skilled not only in healing the body, but also in instilling hope and managing trust. In any case, his life before Montenegro was a harsh school of survival, where every setback became a lesson, and every trial forged his will, sharpening his instincts and developing incredible observational skills. He learned to see the hidden levers of power, the mechanisms of influence, and the vulnerabilities of those who wielded it. The key moment, that point of no return, was likely his realization of his own insignificance in the eyes of the world, coupled with the boundless, almost divine possibility of changing it. In an era when rumors of miraculously saved monarchs stirred minds and people yearned for justice, the idea of assuming another's recognizable, almost sacred identity lay on the surface. But few would have dared to bring it to life, and with such grandeur. Perhaps the impetus was a desperate situation, extreme destitution, a threat to his life, imprisonment, or simply an epiphany that an ordinary, honest life was closed to him, and the only path to greatness lay through a radical denial of his former self. This was not merely a decision to deceive, it was a decision to become another person, so deeply that he himself believed in this new reality and then made others believe in it. He had to not just play a role, but live it, breathe it, think like an emperor. His mind worked like a sophisticated mechanism, analyzing Europe's political landscape, catching the slightest rumors about the fate of Russian Emperor Peter III, who, according to the official version, had suddenly died of hemorrhoidal colic in 1762, but whom popular rumor claimed was murdered and possibly escaped. It was this very uncertainty, this gap between official truth and popular speculation, that became the fissure into which Stepan Maly could drive his wedge. He didn't just choose a name. He chose a legend that already lived in the minds of millions, awaiting a miracle or retribution. He didn't invent the story from scratch. He built upon it, giving it flesh and blood by skillfully weaving existing beliefs and hopes into his fabricated biography. This was a calculated, audacious, and incredibly ambitious step that could lead either to the gallows or to the throne. For Stepan Maly, it seems there were no other options besides these two extremes. It was his personal Rubicon, crossing which condemned him to a life of constant tension, but also granted him a chance at unprecedented power and influence. He ceased to be merely a vagrant, an anonymous, nameless man. He became the living embodiment of a rumor, a symbol of hope for some and a threat to others. This psychological transformation, this self-suggestion, and subsequent imposition of his new identity on those around him became the cornerstone of his future rule. He could not afford to doubt his role for a second, as the slightest crack in his facade could collapse the entire meticulously constructed edifice. His past, whatever it may have been, ceased to exist the moment he uttered the first word. In the emperor's name. It was then, at this point of complete self-renunciation from his former life, that Stepan Maly was born, a man who not only played the role of a Tsar, but became one in the minds of thousands, changing not only his own destiny, but also the fate of an entire people. His triumphant appearance in Montenegro was no accident. It was only made possible by a unique confluence of circumstances, a profound political vacuum, an unbearable economic crisis, and an almost mystical belief in the advent of a savior, all prevalent in the Balkans in the mid-18th century. In that era, Montenegro was not a unified state, but rather a conglomerate of dozens, if not hundreds, of warring tribes whose existence had been defined for centuries by a brutal struggle for survival. Nominally, power belonged to the Orthodox Metropolitans, known as Vladikas. However, their spiritual authority only partially extended to secular affairs, and even that was constantly challenged by powerful tribal chiefs, or glavars. These clans, entrenched in their mountain strongholds, lived by their own, often archaic laws, where blood feuds were not merely commonplace, but a sacred duty passed down through generations. Constant internecine strife, clashes over pastures and water, and endless disputes exhausted the already meager strength of the people, condemning them to a perpetual cycle of violence and poverty. There was no centralized army, nor a unified system of taxation or jurisprudence. Each clan was its own law and defender. The economy of this mountainous region was in hopeless decline. Rocky soils yielded meager harvests, and the lack of sea access and isolation from major trade routes stifled any attempts to establish a profitable economy. Montenegrins lived in constant shortage of food, clothing, and basic necessities. Their lives were a continuous struggle for survival, where each day could be their last. Constant raids by Ottoman troops, who demanded tribute and enslaved people, along with the predatory policies of the Venetian Republic, which sought to control trade routes and exploit natural resources, only exacerbated their desperate situation. These external threats, compounded by internal fragmentation, turned Montenegro into a powder keg, ready to explode at the slightest spark. In this desperate reality, squeezed between two powerful yet hostile empires, the Ottoman to the east and the Venetian to the west, Montenegro desperately sought support. The Orthodox population, which for centuries had shared a common faith with distant Russia, turned its gaze northward, seeing in the mighty Russian Tsar the sole protector against Muslim and Catholic expansionism. The image of the Russian sovereign, great and just, had long transformed into a semi-legendary symbol promising liberation and prosperity. Stories of Peter the Great, who himself had once sent aid and urged Montenegrins to fight the Turks, were passed down by word of mouth, strengthening this bond. This is precisely why rumors of the miraculously saved Emperor Peter III, who might return to lead the fight for freedom, weren't just circulating, they became part of the collective subconscious, a reflection of the people's deepest aspirations. This belief was not a naive fantasy. It stemmed from centuries of oppression, from the desperate need for a strong leader capable of uniting disparate forces and repelling external enemies. Montenegrins, accustomed to self-organization in the absence of central authority, possessed incredible martial spirit and deep devotion to their ideals. They awaited not merely a ruler, but a Messiah who would bring order, law, and most importantly, peace. It was this thirst for justice and unity, this deeply ingrained, almost genetic faith in the Russian Tsar's salvific role that prepared the ground for Stepan Maly's appearance. He did not arrive in a vacuum, but in a world that was already prepared to embrace his legend because it desperately, painfully needed it. And so, in 1766, in the coastal town of Spich, within the territory of modern-day Montenegro, a man appeared, calling himself Peter III. His arrival was not a boisterous declaration but a subtly orchestrated spectacle, played out against a backdrop of profound popular anticipation. Initially he acted cautiously, avoiding direct assertions, yet skillfully spreading rumors about his incredible destiny. He did not openly declare himself emperor. Instead, he allowed the idea to germinate in people's minds, like a seed sown in fertile ground. His first and perhaps most ingenious mystification involved creating an aura of mystery and suffering. He recounted his escape, his miraculous salvation from assassins, and his long wanderings. He even displayed scars on his body, purportedly sustained during the assassination attempt, and a ring which, he claimed, had been personally given to him by Catherine the Great. These details, however dubious, perfectly aligned with the existing popular rumor of a saved Tsar. He didn't just speak, he showed. His narratives were full of drama and personal details that created a sense of authenticity. Concurrently, Stepan Maly, as he later became known, utilized his presumed medical knowledge. He treated local inhabitants, alleviating their suffering, which quickly earned him a reputation not only as a mysterious figure, but also as a merciful one. In the absence of qualified medical assistance, this gesture was an immensely powerful tool for gaining trust. People accustomed to illness and hardship saw in him not only a savior from political oppression, but also a healer capable of bringing relief to their daily lives. This was another equally crucial facet of his multi-layered deception. He offered not just political, but also physical healing. Rumors of the Russian Tsar quickly spread through the mountain villages, reaching even the most remote corners. Crowds of curious onlookers, and then believers, flocked to him. The impostor's authority grew daily, threatening the precarious power of Vladika Sava Petrovic, the elderly metropolitan who nominally headed Montenegro. Vladika Sava, a man of the old guard, immediately sensed the threat and attempted to expose the newcomer. He ordered Stepan Maly's arrest, but his attempt failed. The people, already charmed by the new Tsar's charisma and weary of internal conflicts, sided with the impostor. This became Stepan Maly's first serious test, which he passed brilliantly, transforming a potential downfall into a triumph. Vladika Sava, realizing his authority was slipping, was forced to make concessions. He proposed a meeting with Stepan Maly, hoping to personally confirm his deception and expose him before the people. But Stepan Maly, possessing incredible psychological acumen, transformed this meeting into yet another act of his spectacle. He did not humble himself or offer justifications. Instead, he carried himself with regal dignity, answering the Vladika's questions with such confidence and knowledge of Russian history that even skeptics began to waver. Perhaps he even showed the Vladika certain documents or letters, which, though forged, appeared convincing enough for the era. The culmination of this first stage of his ascent was the so-called Trial of the Tsar, an event that today would be termed a public hearing. In 1767, at a General Assembly of Montenegrins, Stepan Maly once again appeared before the people. Vladika Sava, instigated by Venice and Russia, attempted to prove his imposture. He read letters from St. Petersburg, which explicitly stated that Emperor Peter III was dead, and anyone claiming to be him was a deceiver. But Stepan Maly was prepared. He did not directly dispute the facts. He disputed their interpretation. He declared that these letters were part of a conspiracy against him, fabricated by his enemies who wished to conceal the truth of his salvation. He spoke of Catherine's machinations and her fear of his return. It was here that his brilliant capacity for improvisation and manipulation of the collective consciousness truly shone. He didn't merely reject the accusations, he turned them on their head, transforming evidence of his imposture into new proof of his authenticity. The people, already weary of the lies and intrigues of foreign powers, readily accepted his version. He appealed to their faith, their thirst for justice, and their desire to see him as a savior. And he won. Vladika Sava was forced to retreat, his authority undermined, and Stepan Maly, despite all the attempts to expose him, was recognized by the Montenegrins as their legitimate ruler. This was not merely recognition, it was an almost religious acceptance, an act of faith that transformed a vagrant into a czar. He managed to pass through the fire of doubt and the waters of exposure, emerging not just unscathed, but even stronger, solidified in his new, self-proclaimed, yet now universally acknowledged role. Having solidified his power, Stepan Maly initiated a chain reaction that split Montenegro into two camps, those who found hope and order in him, and those who saw a threat to their long-held privileges. For ordinary Montenegrins, exhausted by centuries of strife and poverty, his rule became a breath of fresh air. He didn't just promise, he acted. His first decrees aimed at ending blood feuds, the cornerstone of tribal conflicts that threatened to annihilate the people. He introduced strict laws against robbery and brigandage, establishing unified rules of jurisprudence, replacing the chaos of audaciously, customary law, with a semblance of centralized justice. These were not mere reforms, they were an attempt to build a state, not merely to manage disparate clans. For the first time in many years, people felt part of something larger than their lineage, part of a unified Montenegro under the protection of the Russian Tsar. They saw in him not only a leader, but also a guarantor of peace, a man capable of bringing order to their strife-torn lives with a strong hand. It was this thirst for stability and justice that transformed them into his devoted supporters, ready to defend his power with their own lives. However, not everyone embraced Stepan Maly with open arms. Vladika Sava Petrovic, the elderly metropolitan and nominal head of Montenegro, became his chief internal antagonist. For Sava, the impostor's appearance meant not only a loss of political influence, but also a profound insult to his spiritual authority. He saw Stepan Maly not merely as a deceiver, but as a heretic who had encroached upon the foundations of faith and legitimate power. Vladika Sava, supported by a segment of the old tribal nobility, unwilling to relinquish their freedoms and privileges, actively dispatched letters throughout Montenegro and beyond, attempting to expose Stepan Maly. He appealed to Russia, Venice, and anyone who could help him reclaim his lost authority and expel the audacious newcomer. His resistance was not merely a personal confrontation, it was a struggle of the old world against the new, an attempt to preserve an archaic system where each chief was his own sovereign, versus the unified, centralized power Stepan Maly sought to build. External players also could not remain aloof. The Venetian Republic, which had for centuries controlled coastal areas and sought complete dominance over the Adriatic, saw Stepan Maly as a direct threat to its interests. A unified, strong Montenegro under the patronage of the Russian Tsar would mean the end of their economic and political influence in the region. Venice immediately commenced subversive activities, spreading compromising rumors about the impostor, funding opposition chiefs, and attempting to provoke internal unrest. For them, Stepan Maly was merely a puppet capable of disrupting the fragile balance of power in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire, Montenegro's perennial adversary, also could not ignore the new ruler's growing power. Any strengthening of Orthodox Slavs, especially under the banner of a Russian emperor, was perceived as a direct threat to their dominion. The Porte closely monitored developments, preparing for military intervention if Stepan Maly began to pose a serious danger to their territories. For Istanbul, he was less an impostor and more a potential catalyst for a new rebellion or even a Russo-Turkish war. However, Stepan Maly's chief and most dangerous antagonist became the Russian Empire, in the person of Empress Catherine the Great. For her, Stepan Maly was not merely a petty swindler, he was a living affront to her authority, a threat to the legitimacy of her throne. In an era of palace coups and peasant unrest, any pretender to the throne, especially one claiming to be a miraculously saved monarch, posed an immense danger. Catherine could not permit rumors of a living Peter III to spread throughout her vast empire, fueling popular discontent and offering hope to potential rebels. Her reaction was swift and decisive. She officially declared Stepan Maly an impostor, dispatched diplomatic notes to European courts demanding his arrest, and, far more significantly, began preparing for military pressure on Montenegro. For Catherine, Maly was not merely an adventurer, but a political weapon in the hands of her enemies, capable of igniting the situation from within. Thus, his appearance transformed Montenegro from a forgotten corner of the Balkans into an arena of complex geopolitical struggle, where the stakes were incredibly high for all participants.